Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming. This is the new, improved, repackaged Society for the Preservation of Military History. And thank you for coming. We had our last lecture, it was 6 months ago, I think. I think you're right, yeah. We just took some time off. I felt like we had reached a point where we were starting to not do what I was currently envisioning us doing. When I started out 17 years ago, the idea was to have a small building and a military history library and an archive. But over those 17 years, we kind of morphed into kind of a military history study group. And even in the last 5 years, doing more in terms of current military history and reaching out into some topics that we hadn't before. So we shut down, we reopened. This is the name of the new organization. We're going to have a website, and you can track the organization there. And it'll have articles and links to things that we're going to be talking about the next month. So if there's a particular article, for instance, tonight we're going to be discussing the Russian-Ukrainian War, the current situation. We would have links, well, we have a link on there already, to things like the CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, which are both excellent resources for finding out just exactly in detail what's going on with that war, and perhaps articles that you can kind of read, because what I would like to do, and one of the things I enjoyed most about the society and what was happening, especially over the last 5 years, was the discussion and the questions and the back and forth that we had with regard to the topics that we're discussing. And that's the part that I was starting to enjoy the most, and we spent the least time on. So what I would like to do is, I set it up like this tonight, but I even envision kind of a large square formation of tables where we just gather, and then maybe some chairs on the outside for people who do not want to just be a part of it, they just want to listen, and we'll have that available too. The reason I set it up like this tonight is because we're also going to try live streaming. We've got several people all over the country that say, boy, you should at least tape them, or you should at least, or do we use the word tape anymore?
Record.
It'd be neat if you could live stream. So, I mean, I've got someone in Washington State who wants to watch it tonight. So we're going to see how that works. But I didn't have your permission to have you on, and I didn't even know how that works. But so next time we'll kind of be in that. And you're welcome to come if you want to participate, and you're welcome to come if you just want to listen. So. But we have some very serious scholars who have a lot of knowledge of specifically military history and even current international relations, and I'd really like to get more into the back and forth a little bit. But before we do that, I do want to set up some guidelines, because I think to promote that idea of discussion and back and forth, I looked up, how forums are run, because I really haven't done that before, and I ran across these things that really kind of were common in most places. And obviously, number one, we already do that already. There's a professional and scholarly discussion. I would be the moderator, or whoever is presenting, because I'm not going to do this every month. We've got people and lecturers and presenters that do a fantastic and better job than I do. They would be the mentor and responsible for guiding the discussion. And to also clearly and thoughtfully share the views. It's not a bashing session. We're not here to bash anything. And also to stay on topic. I feel like I tend to have rabbit holes that I like to go down once in a while. And I get off topic. And we also have people that have a wide range of military history and understanding, and they can draw in other areas of history that pertain to or relate to what we're talking about. And that's part of what I have enjoyed so much. So I think that we can do that as long as it stays close to the topic. And the last one is no Bambis. Has anybody heard what a Bambi is? I do this when I'm up here, and Bambi is an acronym for back at my base. Have you heard of that before? What a Bambi? Yeah. And I do this, back in the Iraq, and I tell you a story, trying to make a comment on something that can pertain to what we're talking about, and sometimes I get off on these tangents. So we're trying to avoid the rabbit holes, avoid the if there's something that's completely relevant to the topic at hand, sure. If we're talking about Somalia and someone's been deployed there, and we've had that happen before, we want to talk about that. But that's basically what I was talking about doing. None of this is designed to discourage conversation, discussion, though, because that's what I really want the most. So I thought tonight we could go through and begin by talking about the Russian-Ukrainian War. And what I envisioned was perhaps 10, 15 minutes, just recounting some things real quickly that have gone on very recently over the past couple months. And some of those have been rather dramatic if you've been watching the news lately. And talk about those things and then expand out into a discussion or give and take on the whole Russo-Ukrainian War and where we think it's headed and where we, is it something that can be derailed and stopped? Is there a ceasefire? All the pertinent issues that we can talk about. We're not going back to 22 and talking about everything leading up to that. But here's the current situation as of June 2025. And maybe if I turn off the light, is it gonna? Does that ruin things?
It makes it better.
It does? Okay. This is just a current map of the general areas of occupation by Russian forces. The stripe obviously is looking at the territory that was seized back in 2014, because it goes all the way back to then. And then the major groupings of Russian forces and the general direction of attack. Let me go back just a minute here and talk about this region up here, because I'm not sure we're going to get it. But very, very recently, the Russians have been having a major buildup across the border from what's known as the Sumy Oblast. Oblast is a term that just refers to like a state or a region, okay? And major concentration of forces here, so there is some concern that that's going to be where the Russians come across next. By the way, before I go any further, I'm not sure where I stand on this thing anymore. My nephew married a Ukrainian girl, and she's like, really hardcore national Ukrainian. And so I was like, yeah, I get that. I'm an old Cold Warrior. Oh, see, I just did a Bambi. But my experience has been that, I grew up during the Cold War, so anything that happens bad to the Russian military, I'm good to go with that. So, but anyways, I don't know where I stand on it, because I can see where, and I hope we talk about that a little bit later on, okay? But I better hurry through some of this stuff. A significant event happened on 13 May, and some of you probably heard of Snake Island earlier in the war that was fought over an island between the Ukrainians and the Russians. But there was, it's in Ukrainian hands currently, and they decided to do a very, very small drone strike against an oil platform down here in this area of the Black Sea. And it was one man in an underground bunker operating a drone. And I wanted to talk to you about this just briefly because it's fascinating. This is actually a picture of Snake Island, not a big place. It's about, and the oil platform, approximately 35 kilometers, something like that, away. Here's a picture of it from the first-person view, FPV, they use a quadcopter that big, carrying 3 kilos of high explosives, and basically cable tied to the bottom of the quadcopter. And the tower was known as Boyko Tower Alpha out here, and on one of those towers, the Russians had put this radar system, which is really to go along with the SA-3 surface air system. But on top of this oil platform, they had about a 45, 50 nautical mile surveillance that was really restricting a lot of Ukrainian activity in the area. And with a small $400 drone, they took out this high-speed radar system, and you can see the explosion there. But that's the kind of asymmetric warfare that's starting to take place there. 28 May, reports started coming out that over 50,000 Russian troops are now gathering in that one, across from that one oblast up in the Sumy region. And that's almost as many troops in that area that were there at the beginning of the war. So clearly the thought is that the Russians might be engaging in like a summer offensive in that area. This is just kind of an update to get us there. These are the oblasts where the Russians have had the most success. Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, and the Crimea that was seized all the way back in. This is the Sumy Oblast up here, and this is where those Russian forces are speculated to, and there's a highlighted area of it. So the concern is that they're going to come down to here, through here, and this is really a major obstacle for the Russian forces, and we'll talk about some of the problems that they've had amongst ourselves. The major event happened just several days ago, and that was June 1st, and it's been described as, I'm not sure that this is the case, but it's been described as the Russian Pearl Harbor. Okay, now, I'm not sure that that's actually accurate, but at these air bases, these drones had been pre-positioned over a period of time in the beds of these trucks. And I'm sure that the Ukrainian satellites weren't the ones that took these pictures. I thought that was interesting that the Ukrainians released a picture. It's probably European or American satellite coverage. But anyways, called Operation Spider Web. Many of you heard of it. And the trucks sat just outside of these major significant air bases and attacked the Antonov, the Russian version of the AN-50, which is their version of our AWACS, the Backfire, and the Bear bombers here. Had a fairly significant attack, but that's all this is. So you're talking about a $300 drone going in and taking out a major nuclear-capable weapon system. And does anybody recognize what that is? The warhead on that? It's an RPG.
Yeah, RPG.
So, I mean, you're not talking about a high-end kind of cost weapon system, and that's all they're doing. And they're strapping. This is really changing the face of warfare as we speak. And there's mortar rounds, attaching grenades, and just letting them ride, and they're very cost-effective. The success that they have had is that many of these drones use analog control, which makes them a little bit invulnerable to many of the jamming systems that take place on some of these against them from the Russians. And I am going to skip because we really don't need to talk about all of these specific air bases. These are some of the weapon systems that the Russians have been using. The Kinzhal is a hypersonic missile. Put them on the bottom of a MiG-25, a MiG-31, or a Backfire 10 Mach 10. Okay, so it's very, very fast. The Caliber Sea Launched Cruise Missile Mach 3. This is the only one of these four weapon systems that's not nuclear capable, and I want to, hopefully we'll get into talking about that a little bit tonight. And the Iskander ground launch missile, and then the KH-55 air launch cruise missile. This is the only one up here that's subsonic too. By the way, Mach 7 for speed for that. And of course, the issue with drones. These are Iranian Shahed 136s. This is what the Russians are using with some success and a lot of failure as well, with measured countermeasures. And that's really all I wanted to kind of present to you tonight. But I want to open it up and talk about what you view as what's going well for the Ukrainians or going poorly for the Ukrainians. There are reports that on both sides that the Ukrainians are in a really good position right now. There are reports that put the Ukrainians in a very, very bad situation right now. So there's a lot of information out there, specific Russian tactics, we can talk about that. But is this, I'll start off the discussion with this. Is this something that can be, President Trump made I'll stop it in a day, right? He made the comment, I'll stop this war in a day. And obviously that hasn't happened. So there's a lot of complexity here. There's the European aspect. But is this something that can be settled within the next few months? Is there a possibility, based on what you've read, what you know, what you think, experientially? Let me be the agent provocateur. I think that we're in one of the most dangerous situations since World War II. I really do. And I think that if you look at the major world wars that have taken place and some of those reasons for having those wars having taken place, we are right on the cusp of being in a situation where this could get out of control very quickly without being able to turn it back. Whether you're talking about nationalism, whether you're talking about spheres of influence, whether you're talking about the militarism, whether you're talking about propaganda, alliances, all of those things feeding that fire of World War, they are at play here, in play. So, what do you think? And by the way, please, anybody, Paul.
I was just going to say, my concern was that, the report about North Korean involvement as far as the number of troops that are involved from that country also.
Do you know some of the specifics of numbers in terms of what they've been used for?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry. Do you know?
I thought I heard like 50,000.
I heard 15, but still, 15,000. That's a U.S. division's worth of troops. That's a significant, and the fact that they're reaching out to the North Koreans and pulling them in, and we've got Chinese weapons and Iranian weapons that are being brought in. There's, all of a sudden there's 5 countries that have tentacles that are intertwined with each other, which creates part of and the way that. Has anybody heard the way that the Russians are using these Korean troops?
Yeah, cannon fire in that Kursk region mostly.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
They are using them in frontal assaults. When they're using Russian troops, what they're doing is they're probing with Russian troops in small squad size elements, and then trying to figure out where, as they wage this war of attrition, they're trying to find out where the weak points are. But the rate of advance has been very, very slow. And one of the Center for Strategic and International Studies has done a research on this and measured the progress in terms of meters and feet. And it's striking how slow the Russian advance is. So they've tried to use these Korean troops to exploit and move faster and for these frontal wave attacks. Jim.
Well, I don't think Putin's gonna allow himself to lose. He doesn't care how many people he throws in there. And it, were those 50,000 people that, or troops there?
Yes,
Aren't they, I'm correct, right off of where all that rare earth stuff is?
yes,
So do you think they're gonna try and capture that whole section where the rare earth is?
there's the northeast, that's rich in very rich in rare earth, and then more towards the center south of the country, there's a line in there that's very rich in rare earth.
I just thought they're gonna try and capture that before they do any negotiating, if they ever do negotiate.
If they do.
But I just don't see Putin ever surrender, doing anything. He's not gonna ever give up any land.
He's been very clear about his objectives.
The Crimea is never gonna go back to Ukraine.
And
I agree.
we've alluded to that before, that the Crimea is really sacred soil to the Russians. I've made the comparison that that's their Gettysburg, kind of, that there are tens of thousands of soldiers that died there, Russian soldiers. And Putin's been very clear about his objectives in this. That paper, that I think it's like a 25-page Mein Kampf style treatise on justifications for going into the Ukraine. Very, very specific. This is Russian soil. These are really Russian people. There's no such thing as Ukrainian.
I agree. I think that, you keep reading the paper and stuff that they keep going to the table to try to have peace, but I don't think there is going to be. I think Russia wants to push until they have the entire Ukraine, that they wipe it off the face of the earth, make all of that area Russian.
Do events like Operation Spiderweb, are those at all successful in your own opinion, in making Putin think twice about what's taking place? If we take the low end figures that were destroyed, the Backfire and Bear bombers and the AWACS, we're talking between 10 and 13 aircraft. And of course they came out and said, well, they weren't really aircraft, they didn't even have engines on them. They wouldn't be in these aircraft revetments if that was the case. But yeah, Dave.
The bombers are no issue.
Okay, explain.
Because bombing forces these days are worthless. They can be taken out with missiles, they can be taken out with jets. They take a long time to come and everybody knows when they're coming and they just pick them off. I think it was an attempt. I see Poland getting shaky at this time as well, because the populist nationalist governments in the former Soviet bloc, they're fighting against the decadent West, which wants them to be more towards our wokeism. The United States has a massive foreign army in the United States at this time. So the United States is
Could you explain that?
the immigrant status.
Oh, okay, all right.
We're gonna have another summer of riots. We had trouble with that in the United States during Vietnam, with all the riots in the cities. That will occur again.
Let me ask you a question. In the Soviet or Russian mindset, it's always been apparent that they place a great deal of stock in these large end weapon systems and capabilities. That still doesn't change.
No, you've already proved it with this talk about using the drone system. I was reading in some other magazines from the military that there's such a push for that the former Soviet countries, as part of NATO, want to go to more cheaper weapons and more of them, so they can fight conventional. I believe the Russians will be glad to fight conventional because they have plenty of equipment to do that. These other countries are only supplied if they have support from the West. And the West, again, is using them as buffers to hurt Russia. And the main problem, and then you have the president saying, well, Ukraine, you surrender, we cut a deal, I get the land. Well, the Russians are already coming for that land. If not to take it where the minerals are, that's part of the so-called 3D chess of the president. Then they'll come here and they'll put threat in that, and that makes Trump say, well, then we gotta make this guy do this, and then this guy do this, because the Soviets, they have all that stuff as well.
Let me reframe it in this question, because we've talked about vertical escalation, right? You throw a rock, I beat you with a stick, and we just throw up a chain of weapon systems, but that way. Are there things, though, that the Ukrainians can do to horizontally escalate as the Russians are completely willing to vertically escalate here, I feel.
Of course, because they, if
And this is for everybody.
yeah, if something caused the Russians to start to feel like they were losing, that's also an opportunity for that nation to have an internal rebellion, which has been the push from the NATO expansion all along. It's trying to cause a breaking down of the Putin-esque style of leadership.
Okay, so what they had, what the Russians have taken over are essentially the predominantly Russian-speaking, Russian-populated oblasts.
Sudetenland.
That's a good analogy, actually. So when we're talking about going further, what I've seen is a Russian military machine that's really a paper tiger. Let me throw that out there. Other people commenting.
All of our militaries are paper tigers. Almost all of them.
Well, okay. Is the Russian military more of a paper tiger than other paper tigers, I guess, is the way to. Because honestly, their ground troops have been abysmal. Jim, you want to say something?
I think that their ground troops are terrible.
Yeah.
Most of them are all conscripts that don't want to be there. They've had huge amounts of people leave the country so they don't get drafted. And,
Which is why they're importing.
yeah.
Same with Ukraine, they're leaving.
And the way they fight, they take mass casualties all the time.
That's right. And that's where we get into that war of attrition idea, where they're just, if you think of the Russian ground forces as a bulldozer, just moving forward, that's that war of attrition, and they're willing to attrit because there's not enough Ukrainians to replace the number of Russians that are dying. It's a I don't know, it's a sum game that adds up well for the Russians, but they're not doing very well.
I have a question. Because in the talk of the fact that the Russians are coming in and they want the Russian-speaking people that they say are Russian, are there people in the Ukraine that are against Zelensky and are willing to not fight for Ukraine, but will back or support or just not fight because they want the Russians to come in?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, there is. And there's not insignificant number of them. However, if we think of Ukraine as a bastion of freedom and democracy and civil rights, that's not the truth. There's no freedom of religion, partly because the Russian Orthodox Church is an instrument, is a Putin of Putin's to be used for propagandizing. It's clear. I can't remember the name of the archbishop's name, but he's always with Putin, and he's the one that controls the message. But also, there's not freedom of speech either, because as an attacked, occupied country, you just can't have people waving Russian flags in Kiev, like we do here in the United States. We have, Mexican flags. Yeah. So, yes, there is dissent. Yes, and Zelensky has purged it from his own advisors and staff. He's very intolerant of any dissent, absolutely. Quickly, Dan, I want to get maximum participation.
Well, I'm waiting for people to
Yeah,
talk.
yeah.
That's how the Russians fight.
Sure,
How do you
absolutely.
think they beat Nazis?
That's a very good point.
Boom, and the Nazis should have beat them, but the reason they couldn't, because there's more coming. Equipment, whatever, anything. That's how the Russians are fighting, and the Ukrainians fight the same way.
No, and,
No,
go ahead, explain.
Go ahead.
No, explain. Well, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but there's a Russian principle of ground warfare called Radvidyenskim boyem, which is reconnaissance in force, which sounds like a really decent principle, except that it is just, you just push everything forward until you find a weakness, and then you exploit the weakness. And if you don't find a weakness, you just keep pouring more into the, once more into the breach, right? I mean, they just continue to push forces, and there's no use of artillery or ground suppression systems that provide any maneuver warfare. They just don't. It's just pound the ground, artillery, lay down artillery, and have these Russian conscripts who are drafted, who don't want to be there, just push forward behind them. But the Ukrainians have slowed the Russian advance to almost nil in certain places, and that's why.
The river.
Well, if it gets that far, Ukraine is done, I think.
The
But
river showed on the map.
Huh?
Yeah, a couple things about,
Yep.
about the barrier you talked about earlier. Is that the
Hold
deeper,
on. Okay, go ahead.
is that the deeper river, the barrier?
Yes.
I thought it was, because that historically is a boundary, what happens with Ukraine, going back a long time to the days of the Rus, that's 1,000 years ago. They were one people, but then the Mongols come in and they separate the area. The area that is Ukraine was conquered by the Mongols and ruled over them, and they killed millions of people there. The Mongols just wiped everything out. And the areas farther north, the Russian areas, the mainland, Novgorod, surrendered to the Mongols. So they were like vassals of the Mongols. But what makes this relevant is that this is how Ukraine became separate from Russia. Then you get much later on, the Dnieper River becomes a boundary because Poland and Lithuania were together as one country.
Yeah.
And over centuries, and they ruled over that part of Ukraine. And Poland is a Catholic country. And they had, in the eastern part, and things didn't go very well. There were big wars in the 1600s that I'm not an expert on, but you bring in the Cossacks and all that stuff. And then, but the Dnieper River became the boundary that the eastern half of Ukraine has leaned toward Russia politically and ethnically. And the western half has leaned toward the west ever since Poland came in. And that was back in the 1500s and 1600s. And then you get up into this time here, what we're seeing here now is that eastern Ukraine tends to be leaning toward Russia. Western Ukraine is standing firm against Russia, mostly standing firm. But
That's excellent.
Yeah,
Excellent.
that's,
Yeah.
and then and most of the gains the Russians are making are in the east.
That's correct, right, absolutely, which is why that fits in perfectly with what you're talking
They don't bomb that area as much as they do to the west,
So, no.
because they don't want to destroy everything that's there. That could turn them away.
Yes. Now, let me throw a wrench into the discussion here by making this statement. There is no moral equivalency between what the Russians are doing and the Ukrainians are doing. There is no moral equivalency whatsoever. We're talking about a conservative estimate of just children pop into my head, of 10,000 Ukrainian children being kidnapped and put in camps, ready to be deported and inside Russia for re-education and Russian language training. So, Dan, would you like to say that? Go ahead.
Yeah, the immigration status, all those children that have been brought across the country,
Well,
it's
you make it
happened,
sound so nice, brought
it
across the
happened in
country.
the United States.
Well, let's focus on Ukraine, okay?
No, I know, he's the baby.
Oh.
With two horns.
See how he threw you under the bus, Tom? So, let's not lose sight that 10,000 Ukrainian children, and I'm talking about, that's a conservative estimate, are gone from their families. They've been taken.
So so the Ukrainian people are gonna keep on losing people to fight, and they're taking them.
Because A, they have to because it's their Alamo, or if you want to be cynical. They want to because they've been told it's their Alamo. So either way, they're going to fight, and they're going to fight like we saw in the early days, them mixing the detergent in with the gasoline for the jelly bombs and things
What would
like that.
happen if the Ukrainians, Zelensky, if they just surrendered and say, we want peace and unconditional, just surrender? What would happen?
Freedom for the Ukrainian people.
Without any guarantees or anything,
Yeah,
just raise the white flag tomorrow. They would become a Russian possession.
All of it?
I would
All
think
of
so,
it,
yeah, yes.
Which has happened historically.
And by the way, Putin has made it very clear, and I believe every word he says,
Mhm.
because he's been very clear about what he wants to do. He has not lied in any way. He says there's no country, this is Russian territory, and he's very much, I mean, if you want to get into psychological kinds of things, he's very much concerned or interested in creating an empire again.
Bring in the
Because-
Soviet Union again?
Yeah, because, and if you go back and look at the fall of the Soviet Union and the development of the Confederation of Independent States and all the turmoil that took place there and the disintegration of Soviet culture and Russian culture, that was a huge thing that happened there that completely wiped it out. You know, we think of, glasnost and perestroika as these wonderful things. That was all window dressing.
Yeah.
Because Yeltsin was just as much a hardliner and son of a gun as
They were communists.
I mean, as a matter of fact, who was Yeltsin's choice to replace him?
So I have a question based on that. If that is true, if that's the Russian mindset, why did they attack Ukraine then as opposed to before at some other time?
Why did they
wait?
not attack him?
Yeah, why did they wait until, what was it now, 4 years ago, 3 years ago? At that point when they invaded Ukraine, why did they do it at that point and not at some other point?
They couldn't. The disintegration of the Soviet military was expanded. I mean, whether you're talking about their navy, the Soviet Navy, their air force, their strategic air forces, any component. One of Yeltsin's first priorities and decisions he made when he came in was that the Russian military would be limited. Russian military would be limited to 100,000 National Guardsmen.
Ah,
So it's like Germany.
Yeah, I mean, they did, because they didn't have the capability to sustain that. And they didn't even have the capability of going to these former states that had nuclear missiles in them and saying, we want them back. They had no power structure to achieve that end. So they just weren't in a position. And for them, it was over. I mean, the party was over. So,
Well, think of all those Arab states, the Stans, they fell away from the Soviet Union as well. So they had to worry about the West and all those Islamic or Muslim countries that are all in Eastern Russia as well.
well, look at
It's the whole
Putin's first actions. Whether you're talking about the Georgian War,
Yep.
or the first and second Chechnyan War. The first one, they got their handed to them.
Yep.
And so, they couldn't even beat a small country like Chechnya. That's how weak they were. And the Russian military had been devastated in Afghanistan for 8 years.
Mhm.
And that was another thing that just, another domino that fell in that. And these hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers that came back to the Soviet Union at that point, you talk about PTSD here from Afghanistan and Iraq, very real. It was very real there too. And there wasn't any support mechanisms. I mean, these guys were throwing back vodka and turning into mafia gangsters all over the place. It was just a awful.
It's taken them a long time to rebuild what they have.
And this is what has created this, all this to say, and I'm talking way too much because I'm more interested in what you guys have to say. That's what's led to Putin and his desire to reestablish the empire. So.
He wants to rebuild the empire of the Tsars.
Absolutely.
Look
yes.
at all the
Of the
uniforms.
czars, it means?
They're dressed like 1812.
The
Yeah.
Tsars actually control.
His honor guards are
Yeah, they look
wearing the uniforms of Russian foot soldier units from the Napoleonic era.
Oh,
They
wow.
guard his palace. Or
And the
palace,
flag.
yeah.
That
So-
flag right there, that's the flag of Peter the Great,
Oh.
the 18th
Oh.
century.
Okay.
And
Let me generate some discussion from you guys with this next question.
Wait a minute, let me write it down. That's 18th century?
Yeah,
Who, Peter the Great?
Peter the Great, it was the Tsar who opened Russia to the west. Because since the Mongol conquest in the 13th century, up to his time, Russia had been isolated from the rest of the world. And
You want to talk about his desire to westernize?
he westernized it,
Yes.
and he went over to the Netherlands and he copied the Dutch flag, that's what that is. And then it's a.
Thank you.
He westernized quite a bit and established the capital of the opening of the Baltic Sea called St. Petersburg. It was in 1703 when that was established. And it's named after.
Are you sure it was 1703 and not 1702?
It may have been both. I think it was both.
Please,
Tom, it's remarkable.
Gregorian calendar.
It's Gregorian calendar, even still, the year.
14 days.
Okay, let him finish. Let him
It was
finish.
14 days service, that's another discussion. But the English-speaking world used an earlier calendar, the Julian calendar, till 1752. But that's a whole other thing. It's not things.
Well, can I expand on
That's a rabbit
that? Before I throw the next wrench in, I want to expand on that a little bit because throughout their entire history, there's always been this kind of, should we westernize? No, we will not. They're out to get us.
That's
There's a
basically
very
Russia's
strong sense of paranoia with regard, hold on.
I'm just thinking.
There's a strong paranoia that exists in the Soviet mindset.
So
And
what do they consider themselves to be then? I mean, are they like Eastern people? I mean, are
That's
they like
part of-
Asian
That is
people?
part of the problem. It is so big that they are a Eurasian state.
Yeah.
And so they reach all the way to the border of China.
Yeah.
And
In Canada, oh, that's